We're back to that issue where we have no volume.
Really?
Yeah. I should hear it say it's recording.
Can you guys
Yeah,
hear
can
us?
you guys hear me? Can somebody type in the chat?
I heard you just fine, and I did say it was recording.
Oh, here. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Haley.
Well, that's because we're plugged into TV.
Okay. Good. I just want to make sure you can hear before I start talking because I know that happened. Thank you, Jeff. All right, crew. Good. So we should be recording. Well, welcome to Tuesday Night Workshop, Monarch Family Chiropractic. We are excited you're here with us tonight to talk about genes and our genetic code and how we express it, and learn a little bit more about the amazingness of our bodies. So I'm Dr. Kristen, for those of you, if you're on the call with us tonight that don't know me, welcome. And we're going to go down, and the slideshow is literally going to be us going through things that I have here in notes from research and trainings that we have done. So we're going to just go through that component together. So hopefully you can see that information, and a lot of data at the end is coming from two specific researchers in the field that we can get you, you could find tons of data from them on. Dr. Bruce Lipton and Dr. Joe Dispenza. So both PhDs in a lot of this research in epigenetics. So looking at genetics and kind of, I feel like debunking things that are miss and things that we think is genetically caused. Hopefully this brings about some information and some questions that you have that maybe you didn't know before. And how this applies to how much more control we have over our health in a way by lifestyle behaviors than I think we're taught, and certainly what's out in kind of talking in mainstream or the medical profession in a lot of ways. So in talking about epigenetics, let's just break down what that is. And it's the study in the field of genetics with cellular and physiological phenotypic traits and variations of that. So that are caused by the external and environmental factors, switching genes on and off, and how the cells read genes instead of being caused by changes in a DNA sequence. So there's a component of really turning things on and off. So it's like a light switch in many ways. So let's break down a little bit more of. I cannot move the screen. Hold on. Nice going. You'd be able to see what I see, and I may or may not be able to do that. Not sure why it does that sometimes. There's one, maybe. There it goes. Okay. Sorry, it freezes up sometimes. So looking at what DNA is. So imagine a ladder or a zipper twisted into a spiral. So I like the zipper analogy. It just makes sense with how things connect. DNA contains the raw information or the instructions that makes us who we are. So we each half of our DNA contains two corresponding nucleic acids that basically together make pairs, or what they call base pairs. So numbering about 3 billion per cell. So there's a lot of light switches with on and offs when we talk about how this comes together. So grouping of long sequences is basically what are called our genes. So there's a lot to do with what proteins, how they play a part. So DNA produce proteins, and that's that raw material that our body uses to construct our anatomy, but also the functions and the complex interactions that make up our physiology. So when we look at proteins, that's controlling immune system, digesting our food, our healing process, chemical reactions in our body. So all of that endocrine system that's changing chemistry throughout our whole body, support of the structural integrity, and then providing molecules to communicate between cells. So when we think about this is where the numbers just are so big that it's amazing how we're made up, how we are. and how much changes on a very fast pace that we don't even know and realize. So when we talk about, okay, proteins are controlling all these things. So the body's manufacturing 100,000 different proteins and many regulatory proteins, about 40,000, that are needed to make up the other proteins. So research that we reference here with the Human Genome Project. So they anticipate that they'd find one gene per protein. But what they found was almost 24,000 genes per protein. So there's so much that is making up our genetic code. There's a reference that that's the same amount found in a roundworm. So think about the complexity of us as humans compared to a worm, right? So it's crazy to think that there are similarities, and yet it's the way they sequence together that makes us who we are, and how we function at such a phenomenal capacity. So genes must work together in that cooperation with one another so that they can be either turned on, right, and expressed, or turned off, suppressed at the same time within the cell. So when you talk about expression, let's go to talking about what makes that up. So environmental, like inside the body, that environment is things like what we talk about, the thoughts, traumas, toxins, and in a way, they separate out here when we talk about expression. So inside the body would be the emotional component, the biological makeup, the neurological makeup, mental, our energetic and even spiritual states of being. Environmental outside capacity of the body would be trauma that happens to us, our temperature shifts, changing altitude, toxicity we're around, things like bacteria, viruses, a lot of chemistry change that happens with foods, alcohol we consume, right? So we change a lot of physiology. We talk a lot about genetic expression this time of year when we're maybe doing things differently, getting into holidays, right? Expressing health differently. It's usually because of the things we're taking in, or that what we're around goes into a different level in state of our genetic expression versus the other weeks of the year when we're maybe not doing the same intensity of things with our system and stressing our system. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But as we go into the components of thoughts in our state of being, let's jump into some of these components that come alongside this inside environment, right? So we think that there's between about 60 to 70,000 thoughts happen in a day. It says 90% of those thoughts are exactly the same ones that we had the day before. So a lot of repetition. This will get into how our body's programmed and how our brain is programmed when we're using just a certain capacity of our brain, and we do very similar thoughts. So we're triggering very similar responses in how our brain fires. So we get up on the same side of the bed. We go through a similar routine in the bathroom, right? How many people we talk about being on autopilot? You go from like your door to your work door or wherever you travel. And sometimes it's like, where was I? Was I zoning off? Was I listening to music, a podcast? And you don't even remember almost getting to and from, point A or point B. It's that autopilot mode of our brain doing a similar sequence all the time. So all these similar things, the way we hold something, the way we may drive a similar route, doing things with the same people. Even a similar emotional response daily based on who we're around or what we do in our day-to-day. So that state of being, taking us from same thought, a similar or same choice, similar actions, behaviors, create a same experience, right? And similar feelings. So if the brain and body stays the same, what does that mean? For life, for expression of life, for genetic expression, right? Or what is our coding doing? What's our programming doing? So if you're thinking the same thoughts today that you will think tomorrow, leads to the same experience in the future, which is why they talk about to change something, you have to do something different repetitively, right? We've got to change our sequencing, change the way our brain perceives things and how it processes. So let's talk about the brain a little bit. This component is something obviously we talk a lot about in this office and in chiropractic. not all offices. And that's a component that really has to be addressed because the brain functions is really your spinal cord is the extension of your brain. So when we think about what it consists of and what it needs, 75% of it is made up of water. It is, so why hydration is so important. And when you don't have hydration for the brain or enough hydration in your body, you have the brain is master, right? It's going to pull from organ systems. It's going to pull from muscle tissue. It's going to pull from all other components so it can continue to function at its highest capacity possible. So just hydration in general for the body is really important for the brain so that this process can happen in our genetic coding. And 100 billion neurons. So that's how many nerve cells are in the brain alone. So we talk about firing neurons. Again, it's that firing process of what we're doing. So being that we kind of talk about brain like a computer, but not quite that. Let's talk about the nerve cell. So think about a root system that can connect and disconnect to other cells. So connections to a cell, anywhere from 1,000 to 100,000. So again, a lot going on that we're not even thinking about. Each neuron is like taking like a biocomputer, right? If you have so much RAM, when you think about a computer, so much memory and how much processing has to happen of data in order to function. Again, 100,000 functions per second is what we're saying, what we're asking our brain to do easily on a daily basis. So when you learn new things, experience different things in life, you're making a new connection, right? A new synapse that then the body with repetition remembers, alters that physical structure of the brain changes, our thoughts then produce a chemical reaction or response, right? That's what's called neurotransmitters. And then that's the things that we hear about or we talk about, right? So your serotonin, the epinephrine, norepinephrine, your dopamine. So your hormones that make you happy, sad, wired, if you will, or more sleepy, or depressed to that degree, right? Depending on how much of that hormone and how much of that constant signal is being expressed, which therefore changes that chemistry and makes that more of a connection that happens on a regular basis. So here's kind of, I guess, a way to break it down. When you're learning something, right, you're creating those new synapses, you're making new connections, remembering that the connections then wire together to create, in a sense, a memory, right? Is that long-term connection between the neurons. So again, repetition creates that new thought process. So going into thoughts, that becomes your changed neurology, your changed chemistry, and then changed genetically. So you gain thousands of new connections in a matter of seconds, depending on things you're learning, new ways of thinking, a new experience. That means that thoughts alone, you could personally activate new genes right away without really even knowing that you are, or even by just changing your mind, right? Changing your thought process on something. So one thing that we get a lot in meeting with patients from the first time to even sometimes later in care, when other things come up, or we start to meet other family members within a family that we're taking care of, a lot is thought to be genetic. And this isn't true, but it's not really what I feel like is mainstream talked about, which is that they find so much is not genetic as far as, oh, my parents or my grandparents had this must have been their genetic code and it was passed to me and now I have that genetic code. The things that have real genetic code associated to them that we hear about or maybe would know the terms of would be things like sickle cell anemia, somebody that's type 1 diabetic, and Down syndrome. So most other stuff that we symptomatically experience or conditions are not genetically based. It is something that your body has turned these genes on and other coding on and expressing different coding based on these connections made and based on the lifestyle, the process you've gone through, usually with a lot of repetition. So for someone to say, oh, well, you know, my so-and-so or my parent or my grandparent had this, that must be why I have that. Most of that is not true science. You may express similar codes because you were raised by those people. You may give an example with certain conditions that people think are genetics, even just from like dietarily ate the same, may have the same, you know, thought process, viewpoints. It's a lot of lifestyle learned behavior. And that makes that connection and that wiring, if you will, in your brain. And therefore makes that in a sense code turn on for you, just like it did for them, but isn't necessarily genetic. That's just, it's passed on traits that you have done by changing the way in which your brain has made those protein and neuron patterns, right? So going into the components, really that we address is really looking at that thought process, looking at the brain function and how much it controls, how important it is. And I feel like how much it's stressed the least as far as how imperative it is that we are supporting the brain first. So when we talk about chiropractic and subluxations, that is stress on the brain. That is the brain not doing, either overworking or underworking at the capacity it needs to, and usually then creating an inability for it to adapt to its environment and be able to change, in a sense, that neurological pattern. So subluxation is really creating ability for it to not be adaptive as well as it could be. And so when we're looking at the adjustment, sure, it usually starts with somebody coming in with an ache or a pain or a trauma or an injury or something like that many times, or sometimes very old ones that have then created very chronic conditions. And we first have to change the brain function, because then the body can communicate at a better capacity. It could create and make new synapses and patterns. And then your body, of where that expression comes from, is from the brain through the spinal cord, then can respond to an environment differently, can then respond to a movement differently, right? It can respond to whatever that path is that you're putting it under differently. And for the most part, for most people, have a more responsive or have a bigger response. Or so for a lot of people, when a subluxation stays there long enough, that stress stays there long enough, the brain starts creating a different pattern, right? To get its job done. Most of the time, that's just it overworking and it doing it in an inefficient way. And when we can remove that interference, the brain just goes, thank you. I can do a job, but it doesn't necessarily know what job we need it to do. Because again, it's based on those synapses, right? That we've created or that we've lost and need to recreate. So it's about creating new patterns and new synapses so that the brain says, okay, I get it. You want me to do this. This is a more supportive, healthy, natural, communicative pattern that then supports the healing process. So we're not healing you. The adjustment is being delivered to remove an interference so that your body can heal itself, so that your brain can send that signal clearer, create a better, healthy synapse, and then create a pattern from that, right? So when we talk about a care plan in here, at whatever phase you're at in age, degeneration, all the things, it's based on, multiple things, but your success is different than maybe someone else's, depending on what is that synapses process, how long has that been there? What does it take to change that pattern? So it includes for us, obviously, adjustments. Those of you that have been under care, that there's things we ask you to do that might be very different than where you've been before, which is exercises for the brain, exercises for postural muscles that have to fire differently, right? To create different synapses, and creating things like with where it says mindfulness of breathing. If you were on some of the workshops we did earlier in the spring, we'll be coming back to those here at the beginning of next year, going back into the breath work, talking about the polyvagal tone, right? So everything that supports that resetting and supporting the process of brain, in a sense, slowing down and communicating clearer, right? If you could tap into the biggest nerve throughout their whole body, then it's going to create a better, again, connection with synapses through the whole process of where it has to communicate to. So when we're using workshops, again, like this, it's to give you some of those tools to know you have more power to change your health than most people think, or are led to believe based on what we just see in our society, or what we're told by, sometimes it's a doctor, or what we just are being told by who raised us, you know, you're going to have this because I had this. And a lot of that just isn't truth in what we know about genetics and the epigenetic component. So changing physical structure definitely happens. Changing the thought patterns has to happen in order for a change in other components. So again, our care plans are designed when you think about it from this perspective. What you benefit from is, of course, usually better function, better movement, more flexibility, less pain, but it's because your brain and body are communicating at a higher capacity and at a different synaptic pattern. So being able to change that is possible for everybody at every stage of life and every age of life. Some patterns just may have been there longer. So changing that is really neat to see how much room you have to do so, if you're ready and willing. So the sources here are two of the docs that we reference in this article with some of the stats, but have much more data behind the research they've done. So Biology of Belief is one of the resources that Dr. Lipton wrote, and You Are the Placebo is the other. So if I would take down that information, if some of this stuff interests you and you want to dive into some of the in-depthness of different things they've studied. I feel like Dr. Bruce is really good at explaining things in a very non-super sciencey way that you can read it and make sense of a lot of what he does. And he's so well-versed. So if you have other questions, please bring them our way. We love that. We love knowing what your takeaway was from workshop when we see you next. And I appreciate you all being here tonight to learn more about how you can change your brain, your body, your world, your lifestyle, and those ahead of you that you're raising, and teaching them how much they can impact theirs. So I am going to say thank you for being here tonight and being on workshop. And we will see you next Tuesday as we get into December on our next topic of the difference between adjustments and manipulation. Another thing that I want to express and let you guys know is that our Patient Appreciation Day is coming up, week is coming up. It's going to be December 12th through the 15th, I believe. Looking back behind me at our calendar. Yeah, 12th through the 15th. So if you are new to the practice, this is a time that we love opening up our office and the practice to those that you care about. So, one second here.